So here we're looking at a very famous piece by the economist Milton Friedman. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, and I consider this a very problematic piece because it's kind of takes a few readings to actually sort out for oneself exactly what Friedman's getting at in this essay. And I think the first problem is the title. If we read the title, what we're expecting, I think, anticipating is a kind of an Adam Smith argument, something like the invisible hand, something like the idea that business in its pursuit of its own self-interest, that is profits, is fulfilling a social responsibility. But is that what the piece is that what it's really about? Certainly that seems to be in the background. Friedman, maybe he's not as famous as he used to be generally, but very, very prominent advocate of the free market being, the best way to organize an economy, and in that general sort of proponent of free market economics. And it seems to be in the background here. But as far as what he actually says, I think the title is actually very misleading. It may even be ironic, I guess, really, because we expect an account of how business as a whole contributes to the social good. Again, something along the lines of the Adam Smith argument. But one of the first things he says on the first page in the second paragraph indicates that really can't be what he's getting at all. I'll tell you why. He says the discussions of the, quote, social responsibilities of business, unquote, are notable for their analytical looseness and lack of rigor. What does it mean to say that business has responsibilities? Only people can have responsibilities. Okay. A corporation is an artificial person, and in this sense may have artificial responsibilities, but business as a whole cannot be said to have responsibilities, even in this vague sense. So maybe corporations, individual corporations, as artificial persons under the law, can have artificial responsibilities, but business itself is too vague an entity to assign any kind of real responsibilities. So he says the first step towards clarity in examining the doctrine of the social responsibility of business is to ask precisely what it implies for whom. Presumably the individuals who are to be responsible are businessmen, which means individual proprietors or corporate executives. That is, it's really not about either the social responsibility of business considered as an entity, as a sort of a class or force or a state, or somehow sector of society, or even about individual corporations and their maybe artificial responsibilities of artificial persons. It's really about the responsibilities of individuals. It's about individual ethics, you might say, in this essay. And whom is he focusing on? He says most of the discussion of social responsibility is directed at corporations, so in what follows, I shall mostly neglect the individual proprietors and speak of corporate executives. So one might say that this, this essay, which I think it does, its main argument focuses on the obligations, the duties, the role of the corporate executive. And I think that there's all sorts of other things in the background here, but if we're looking for what is actually argued for in the essay, it is that. What are the responsibilities that apply to that role of being a corporate executive? And I think that he makes one big point in this essay, and it seems to be a pretty forceful point. We'll see people criticizing this point later on. But in the next paragraph on the first page, he says, in a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom, which makes that qualification of ethical custom, I think, is something to keep in mind as well in terms of evaluating whether Friedman's argument is something that has analytical rigor. But that point is a very strong one. That is, if one is talking about corporate executives, one is talking about employees of a corporation. And if it is a public publicly held corporation. His employers, at least officially, lawfully, if not directly, are the shareholders of the company. And the important thing to keep in mind in this is, as an employee of a corporation, he is an agent. That is, he is a person who is obligated to work in someone else's interest, at least in terms of his or her professional life. So he ends that paragraph on page 1 by saying the key point is that in his capacity as a corporate executive, the manager is the agent of the individuals who own the corporation, and his primary responsibility is to them. Well, that really does provide a certain framework then for thinking about the ethical responsibilities, at least broadly, of the corporate executive. That is, that the primary duty, Friedman seems to be claiming, of the executive is to the shareholders of the corporation. It is not to any other sector of society, any other interest group, the public good, anything like that. Putting all that aside in terms of the validity of working towards the good of any of those groups, officially the corporate executive is an agent, an executive of the will of the shareholders. And what is his major point here? Well, I mean, if as he continues, and you can read it for yourself, that if the corporate executive feels that there is anything in society that the resources of the corporation can help, can further, can ameliorate, and he mentions, controlling inflation, helping with the employment of people who calls hardcore unemployed. That we can think of all sorts of other things. I'm not sure he mentioned some things like the environment. He does talk about prices and things like that. That without criticizing those things as public goods, without denying that they're public goods, what is Friedman's major point? That the corporate executive has absolutely no right to employ the resources of the company to further their ends. Why? He says on page 3, the whole justification for permitting the corporate executive to be selected by the stockholders is that the executive is an agent serving the interests of his principal. This justification disappears when the corporate executive imposes taxes and spends the proceeds for social purposes. That notion of taxation, which is really, that is a metaphor. Of course, the corporate executive is not imposing taxes in a literal sense on anyone. The corporate executive would be making decisions about what a company should do with its resources in the pursuit of its ends, or thinking about what ends it should pursue. But you can see his general point there. That is, that if the corporate executive employs the resources of the corporation in any way other than the intent, the intended goal, pursuit of the goal of profit for the corporation, therefore profit for the shareholders of the corporation, that he is or she is, of course, we should update this, plenty of female corporate executives, that's a good thing, like 1970. But he or she is, in effect, imposing taxes on the shareholders, that is, reducing their gain from their ownership, their partial ownership of the corporation. That is, unilaterally deciding that the corporation should do something else with its resources besides make money, I guess. It's a strange idea, but this would be, in effect, imposing taxes on the shareholders. That, it seems to be the heart, the core of his argument. He goes on to make a lot of other points, for instance, on page 3, that really corporate executives do not have the kind of expertise to pursue social goals that one would presume is necessary, that they're trained in their field, and they're trained in business. They're not trained in social policy and what would be the best move to, to control inflation or to increase employment, things like that. Uh, I think that's about it. I mean, as far as like the really rigorous, strong claim that he's making, he says all sorts of other things after he makes that major claim that this is the notion that businesses have social responsibility as a form of socialism, and this is bad because it's it is an intrusion of politics on the market, and if we're concerned with freedom and non-coercion, we should let the market operate freely because there's no coercion, because all trades are thought to be consensual on the part of both parties, and things like that. He also says some things which might actually undercut his argument, because he makes the claim at least twice. For instance, first time on page 2, that not only would the corporate executive, in pursuing these social goals, be taxing the owners of the company, the shareholders, but also the customers of the company and its employees. He says there on page 2, in each of these cases, the corporate executive would be spending someone else's money for a general social interest, insofar as his actions in accord with his social responsibility reduce returns to stockholders, he is spending their money. Insofar as his actions raise the price to customers, he is spending the customers' money. Insofar as his actions lower the wages of some employees, he is spending their money. That's a very strange thing to say, because certainly the corporate executive is in a legal and ethical relationship, according to him, with the shareholders. That is, he is their agent and executive, so what he can do with that money is limited. To extend the taxation metaphor to customers and employees doesn't have the same basis, of course, because the corporate executive is not the agent of the customers, nor is he or she the agent of the employees. So one wonders why Friedman threw that in there. He does it twice. That is, the corporate executive is acting in the interest of the shareholders. He or she is not acting in the interest of customers or employees. And one would imagine that if Friedman had to weigh in on the matter, that if a conflict of interest appeared between the employees or customers on the one hand and the shareholders on the other, that the corporate executive would be bound to act in the interest of the shareholders against the interest of those other two stakeholders or parties, you might say. So I'm wondering, that seems to be that's definitely something to think about. That is, that Friedman wants to broaden this idea a little bit to include the interests of these other parties, but I wonder if there's really a basis for that. So this is a very interesting and provocative essay. It makes a lot of subsidiary points about freedom and the best sort of ethical situation between people in terms of market. And he talks about coercion versus unanimity and things like that. But those are very sort of suggestive and speculative ideas in a short piece. I think what we come out of this with is that basic idea that the actions of a corporate executive or any employee of a business, whether it's publicly held or not, are severely limited by that relationship, and that one may think that, just think about that, that is, in terms of the ethical goals of the executive may not match up with the interests of the shareholders, and then one wonders, what is exactly the right thing to do in that case? If we presume that the shareholders are interested in profit and nothing else, does that mean that the corporate executive is bound to pursue profit wherever he or she can, no matter what the ethical issues are, as long as it's within the boundary of the law? He does qualify that by throwing in things like ethical custom and things like that. But in any case, a very interesting piece, a very misleading title, a very interesting thesis at the center of it about the corporate executive and his or her limitations.